The Nigerian National Petroleum Company, NNPC, now has a new face, which officially changes the oil firm from a wholly state-run entity to a commercial oil company. The new NNPC Ltd has been described as a child of the Petroleum Industry Act, passed into law in 2021. The official unveiling came weeks after the corporation transitioned into a company whose operations will be regulated by the Companies and Allied Matters Act, CAMA. Joining us on the show this morning as we discuss the rebirth of NNPC is Dan Kule, energy and infrastructure expert, and Mansur Ahmed, Dangote Group Executive Director on Government and Strategic Relations and current President, Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. But first, we'll begin with Mr. Mansur, and later, Dan Kule will join us to wrap up the discussion on the commercialization of the NNPC. Good morning, Mr. Ahmed. Welcome to the morning show.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, good morning, Engineer Mansur Ahmed. Well, in your other life, when you were in government, you were involved in the process of government trying to be more efficient and, trying to worry about public corporations and all of that. What do you make of this transition, or some people use the word transformation, of the NNPC from a public corporation to now a limited liability company called NNPC Ltd? Some people say that this is just old wine in a new bottle and that not much may change. But NNPC Group CEO, NNPC Ltd Group CEO, Engineer Mele Kyari, says no, certain things have changed and that NNPC has changed for good. What do you say to this?
Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, let me seize this opportunity to congratulate the management of NNPC and the board, and of course, all stakeholders in this issue. But this journey has been on for over 30 years. The effort to transform NNPC into a commercially viable enterprise had been going on, as far as I recall, since around 1987. Under the leadership of late Dr. Ruwan Dukuman. I was recruited into the NNPC in 1988 as part of the process of transforming the corporation. The intention then was clearly to create an NNPC that remained at the initial stage, a government entity, a public entity, but operated purely as a commercial entity in competition with other oil and gas companies in the environment, both domestic and foreign. Unfortunately, as I'm sure many of us who had been on this journey would recall, the effort sort of literally failed, largely, I think, because to a large extent, government was not able to create the environment that will facilitate NNPC to operate in that mode. The legal and regulatory environment was not ready. NNPC was expected to operate both as a commercial entity in competition with others, but also to carry responsibilities as a public sector regulatory agency, as well as a revenue collector for government. Those roles simply contradict each other, and it was not possible to get to where we are today. And there have been several other attempts since then. I remember in the early 2000s when I believe Nasser El-Rufai ran the privatization program for government, several efforts were made to begin to, if you like, commercialize NNPC through some form of privatization and private sector participation in the operation of the company. Again, these efforts did not yield the desired result. Largely, as I said, because government itself was not ready to do what was necessary, but also because there are, as indeed there are today, a large number of interested parties who obviously drove tremendous benefits from the status quo. Rent-seeking activities were indeed so prevalent that those people were not willing and ready to allow an NNPC to run the way it was intended to run. This merger of, if you like, pecuniarily interested people, rent seekers, and public sector agencies who obviously wanted to retain control and responsibility for the running of the corporation, simply refused to allow the NNPC transformation as had been intended to do. So perhaps we should say now we are here at last after probably 3 decades of effort, and we can only hope that this time around, both the government and other stakeholders involved in the operation of the NNPC or interested in the operation of the NNPC will see the need to allow NNPC to go the way it was intended to do. And I believe that perhaps peak, the conditions have been totally different, and therefore there's probably more likelihood that with the increase in effort from all parties, we should be able to succeed. But it's up that there are certain things that of the NNPC can indeed succeed this time.
Right. I was going to jump in there when you talked about stakeholders allowing NNPC Limited to succeed. Who might those stakeholders be, and what about, let's talk about their resistance to the new arrangement, specifically the sensibilities of the Nigerian Governors Forum, who have in recent times publicly criticized NNPC for having publicly declared a profit for the first time in almost 44 years and yet not remitting any funds to the FAAC. The Nigerian Governors Forum spoke out against that. And now some misgivings exist about the new arrangement as shareholders. What do you make of that whole arrangement? And do you think that state governments are left out in any way in the code?
Well, when I talk about stakeholders with interest in the status quo, I'm not just talking about government stakeholders, the Governors Forum and other key institutions that are interested in sustaining the situation as it is. I'm talking about all sorts of stakeholders that see in the sustenance of the status quo ante where we were before some benefits, and we're driving those benefits, and we'll do anything to ensure that those benefits are sustained. These are not just domestic stakeholders. I think there are even international companies and agencies that are driving tremendous benefit from the way NNPC was operating, and therefore would do anything to keep that status quo. Now, with regards to government, I think the situation, as I said, the problem is the legal and regulatory environment that guided the operation of NNPC. And if the role of the other government agencies, for instance, like the Governors Forum, is that based on the existing legal and regulatory arrangement, clearly the Governors Forum and others whose institutions are part of the existing arrangement will obviously be cautious about a situation that changes that arrangement until they can see how their own interests will be covered. For instance, as you said, the Governors Forum see in the operation of NNPC the current existing arrangement whereby they drive a significant portion of their revenues from the revenues that's been driven by NNPC operations. And so if you say you're going to remove NNPC from that position and create a new arrangement, they would want to know how would this arrangement affect our interests. And I think that's probably the basis of the response of the Governors Forum, and perhaps even, if you like, the other institutional interests. Now, one of the things that had to be done, and I think we are now beginning to see action in this regard, is that we must look at the legal and regulatory arrangement around NNPC operations. The Act, the Petroleum Industry Act, for instance, has brought significant changes in that arrangement and has created, if you like, a new basis whereby the revenues from our oil operations, from the national oil interests, will be if you like, will flow in a different direction, a different mode. And perhaps if this is clearly defined in a way that the governance forum can see that it does not affect unfavorably their interests as part of the revenue sharing arrangement, they probably would not have the same kind of attitude as you suggest they're having now. But again, commercial interests as well, of course, also will see a situation where the new NNPC Limited will be operating on a totally different plane, and they will want to make sure that it will compete on a level ground, a level playing field. Because, as you may recall, in the past, NNPC was both a commercial entity competing in that context, but also it was more or less like a revenue collector for government as well as a regulator, because some of the regulatory agencies of the government were part of the NNPC system. So it's absolutely important that we begin to see these these issues that will constitute the environment, the operational environment for NNPC, and they ensure that that environment is set or reset in a way that will ensure that NNPC can operate competitively, and that it will relate with government in a more arm's length basis, so that there will be it will not take advantage, perhaps in terms of its competitive relations with other stakeholders and so on. These are some of the things that have to be done.
Okay.
But as I said.
Okay, finish up your thought, Mr. Mansur, before I ask you the question, sir.
Yes.
I said
yes.
Finish up
Well,
your
I was going to say that having reached this point where we are now resetting the environment for NNPC's operations, we must also recognize that it is not going to be easy. It's going to be tough. First of all stakeholders involved will have to face the new realities, particularly within the NNPC and within government, in a way that ensures that we allow the institution to operate the way it is. Also, those who are taking responsibilities for decision-making in the past must recognize that today the decision-making process is going to change very radically. People who in the past had responsibility for taking certain decisions may no longer be responsible for taking those decisions. Okay. People who in the past did not have responsibility for taking certain decisions may now have responsibility. And both types of people must recognize this. Let me start with the management and NNPC. In the past, we have always had a situation where at the end of the day, the final decision is taken by government. For instance, the decision on pricing, the decision on allocation, for instance, of crude, the decision on how do you use the revenues coming out from NNPC, etc. All these were being taken at the highest level of government, particularly in the recent years. Now, management of NNPC and the board in particular will now have to take responsibility for those key decisions. Allocation of resources to the various operational areas, what to do with aspects of the operation that are not performing, how to ensure that performance is the guide for, if you like, compensation and so on and so forth. The issue of all the various contributory factors to efficient operation will now be the responsibility of the management and the board of NNPC. And those management and board must be willing and ready and capable of taking those decisions in an efficient and effective manner. So to a large extent, this will require new thinking and a new mindset for the various parties involved in the management and the revenue of NNPC.
Okay, Mr. Mansur, thank you so much.
For instance, what should be the...
Okay, Mr. Mansur.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you've said a lot as regards the composition. What should be these are what ifs. A lot of people are arguing that it's not today government always own commercial companies. I can start from the days of Basita Sugar in '64. Even this NNPC we're talking about, Warri Refinery Company, we all know all of that. People are asking, how quick can we get them ready for IPO? Will they pass the due diligence for IPO if they are to be quoted on stock exchange in London and the likes? People are very iffy about the composition of the shareholders that Ministry of Petroleum, Ministry of the Treasury, Ministry of, what's it called now? Ministry of Petroleum, Ministry of Treasury, and other sundry governmental ministries in there. You know, people are iffy about those things. They're saying it's still new wine in old bottle. It's not going to work, and that time will tell. What do you say to all these concerns expressed?
Yes. Well, first of all, let us understand that there is going to be a transition period, a transition process, when a lot of things that will have to exist in order to ensure that the transformation can take place on an even keel. But change has to come. First of all, even starting from the issue of ownership. Yes, NNPC is today 100% owned by government. But can NNPC remain like that and be able to be competitive in the international oil and gas market, going forward? One of the things that have been suggested is that perhaps some stage NNPC may have to go public. But you cannot go public overnight. And therefore, the key issue is, yes, we recognize that asset now government is the 100% owner, and therefore the board must comprise of representatives of the government, however it is composed. But there must be a target period within which that ownership will change so that NNPC goes public. Government can retain significant interest in it, no problem. 49% interest, for instance, as we see in LNG. That can happen. But the process of reaching that point must also be properly defined and properly guided. It can't happen just like that. Secondly, I think there are certain things that the corporation, the company has to do. It has to look at all its operational areas and say, which of these operational areas should we focus on? Which ones should we simply discard? In my view, for instance, NNPC will have to jettison the entire refineries of the companies. Because in my view, I do not see a practical way in which NNPC can resuscitate and reorganize and put these refineries back in full operation with the efficiency they need to be able to return, to be profitable over the next few, without huge investments that neither NNPC nor the government can generate at this point. So we may have to start thinking about, okay, what will be the new NNPC in terms of the areas of operations and what it's doing, right? It's not, nobody says NNPC must be a refiner and an oil producer and a gas producer and transport company. These things are going to have to evolve or re-evolve over time. If, for instance, today we said, look, okay, take off the refineries, form another NNPC asset management company and hand over those refineries to them. Let them decide how to handle them. But for NNPC to operate efficiently, it cannot carry the burden of those refineries that are producing zero products at this moment at huge cost. It is a drain pipe for NNPC's revenues. So let NNPC identify from all its portfolios which of these portfolios are likely to be turned into profitable operations very quickly, and I mean very, very quickly, within the next year or two. Which of these companies will need some support to sustain, for instance, their cash flows in a way that they can then become profitable? And how do we move forward on this so that we focus on those assets and those portfolios of our operations that will indeed generate the commercial viability of the company? That is the number one incentive, the number one objective of the transformation of NNPC. And I think it's only when we do that that we can then define a new trajectory for NNPC's growth. And in this regard, of course, it's not just shedding off the assets in terms of the institutions. We must also look at how the corporation, how the company is being managed now. Do we have the right structure to manage the new NNPC Limited? What changes do we have to make? What kind of new personnel attitudes as well as competences do we need? I believe that, yes, we have the competences within the country. We have clearly, we can operate any oil and gas company successfully if we wish to, but we must do it consciously. And it is absolutely important that NNPC management and the board have the courage and the commitment to take those hard decisions, especially about personnel, about pricing, about resource allocation that will ensure profitability and generate sufficient cash flows to enable us to transit into a viable commercial entity.
Okay. Dr. Abati?
Well, Engineer Ahmed, if you can hear me. Engineer Ahmed, well, very quickly. Two things. The first is this thing about the Ministry of Finance Incorporated. Some people are arguing that, yes, the Ministry of Finance Incorporated as a major shareholder, representing the interest not of the federal government alone, but also of the states, because it's about the federation rather than the interest of the federal government. But if you look at the board as constituted now, all the persons there are federal government appointees. How soon are we likely to see that transition whereby the interests of the state governments will be accommodated? We tried to put this question to Governor Autumn, we spoke with earlier, but he said he's still studying the details. That's one. The second one is, you talked about the refineries now. Under President Obasanjo, the refineries were privatized, so to speak. President Yaradua, when he got into office, reversed what the Obasanjo government did. Now, we're dealing with the PIA, giving effect to this new dispensation in the NNPC. Is there any guarantee that a future government will not come, considering the fact that the PIA is controversial in many parts, and then reverse what has been done now? And if that happens, at what cost would that be? Or you think what has been done is irreversible?
Yes. Well, first of all, let's address the issue of the current structure of the board. Yes, as at today, NNPC is owned 100% by the federal government. Now, some will say by the federation. But when you look at the law, clearly the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, representing the government as a whole, both the federation, if you like, sits as, if you like, the representative of the shareholders on that board. And I think this is what I said before, that over time, this will have to change. But it cannot change overnight. And to a large extent, what needs to be done is for the shareholders, and that means perhaps federal government, state government, local government, all the other key institutions that represent shareholders, and that's the whole of Nigerians, must now sit down and say, how do we structure the ownership of this corporation, of this company? And how do we also create an environment whereby other owners can come in? We open up the company to bring in owners. That is why I talked about going public, right? Now, once the decision is made at the shareholder level, then of course the next thing is to restructure the board appropriately. It may well be that you can have a situation where the Ministry of Finance, whether incorporated or the Ministry of Finance itself, represents the federal government, and the state government may be asked through some measure of collaborative arrangement to nominate their own representatives on the board. And of course, as you go forward and open up the company and the equity to other shareholders through perhaps public listing, of course, other key stakeholders may come in, and we may have therefore the need to create a possibility of other representatives on the board, working on the board. So this is something that will have to be, it can't happen like this. It's not, you can't turn a key and everything changes. So it has to be planned and properly organized in a way that can take us from where we are to where we want to be. But like you said, it requires commitment and political will. Because frankly, yes, you say we can do a law today, some other government can come and change the law. The only perhaps way you can mitigate that is to make sure that the lawmaking agency, the National Assembly, is also committed to ensuring that the law is, whatever changes are made to promote the intention or the interest of the overall, the entire federation, rather than either a federal government or state government or whatever. So it's a process that will have to take place, and in which all key stakeholders will have a share in the decision making, depending on what kind of decision is being taken. But at the bottom of it, I believe that the governors, if you like, governors forum, should be looking at the long-term expectations, the long-term interests of the company, not the company, the long-term interests of the country. What do we want? We want an NNPC that will grow and generate wealth beyond its own, so that all stakeholders can have a share in that wealth. We want an NNPC that can create opportunities for expansion across the entire country. Indeed, one of the things that unfortunately has not happened is that over the years, because of the attitude to ownership, because of attitude to if you like, what we're getting out of it now, the NNPC has not actually been able to grow the way it should. If that has happened and it has grown, and for instance, NNPC is today producing, let's say if NNPC is producing half of the total crude being produced in this country, and that could have happened, but it would be generating resources beyond the imagination of the governors forum. And those resources will ultimately go down the line to reach the stakeholders, and that's the governments at the federal, the state, and the local government level. But because we are focused on immediate satisfaction of our current need, irrespective of how that, we are focused on sharing the cake rather on building the cake. We have tended to keep the cake small. Indeed, we have tended to constrain the development in a way that the cake has grown smaller. And that is why we keep it. I think perhaps what has now generated this situation, whereby now people, both at government level and outside, are beginning to see that the only solution to the NNPC is what we're doing now, is commercialization, privatization, opening up and allowing the company to operate as a commercial entity, to grow and to create wealth. I believe we have come to that position largely because now we see very clearly the possibility that if we continue the way we are, the cake will one day shrivel to a point where indeed all of us would have lost.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.